At first glance, the title of this video may suggest a journey into fantasy and fiction, the kind of nonsense usually reserved for certain kinds of popular TV documentaries much in vogue at the present. I'm reserving judgment, but I think it's also important to see what evidence there is for a Nazi flying saucer program. We can all accept that during World War II, the Germans led the world in the realm of aeronautical engineering. They produced many cutting-edge vehicles way ahead of their time, from the Messerschmitt 163 rocket interceptor to the V-2 ballistic missile, the first man-made object to officially enter space in 1942. Rumours abounded during and after the war that German engineers had also been trying to perfect circular-shaped aircraft. The engineer often credited with inventing the flying disc, at least on paper, was Josef Andreas Epp. He designed a craft that was circular with a helicopter-type rotor attached to the top. Epp had been inspired by witnessing the flight of the experimental Focke Wulf Fw-61 helicopter in 1938. Epp created 4 design drawings, all equipped with a main rotor with the airframe in the centre. Epp's designs were essentially disc-shaped helicopters with adjustable rotor blades. Epp claimed to have built some 1/10th scale models of this design, which he sent to the Ministry of Aviation in Berlin in 1941, hoping to obtain a contract. The designs and models were examined by staff from the office of General Ernst Udet, chief of the technical office. They were judged to have some merit, and in turn the material went to General Dr. Walter Dornberger, then head of the secret weapons programs at Peenemünde, which included the V-1 and the V-2. Dornberger's staff conducted further tests. A facility was then created at Prague Airport in German-occupied Czechoslovakia to begin full-scale design and build of a flying disc. The project was placed under the control of engineers Rudolf Schriever and Otto Habermohl, with technical assistance from the Luftwaffe, Skoda and Junkers. The project was later placed under the auspices of Albert Speer's Armaments Ministry, until in 1944 it was absorbed along with the V-weapons program by the SS, headed by Obergruppenführer Dr. Hans Kammler. Schriever and Habermohl allegedly built a flying example of their disc. Called the Flugkreisel, or flying gyro, it incorporated some of Epp's design, with a series of new innovations, having a weight of 3 tons. A photograph allegedly taken by Epp exists today that shows a flying disc actually in flight over Prague Airport. Epp was called in to consult on the Schriever-Habermohl project when they faced problems, and Epp took the picture over some foliage as he drove to the airport in August 1944. Epp claimed that the photograph shows one of the first unofficial flights of the disc, which was officially listed as having flown for the first time in January 1945. This contention was supported by Georg Klein, the chief engineer on the projects at Prague Airport, in post-war interviews. A Luftwaffe test pilot named Otto Lange gave a signed statement after the war, describing his role in piloting the flying disc. This, of course, should all be taken with a pinch of salt. Aside from the Epp and Schriever-Habermohl projects, a third flying disc project was also running concurrently at the airport. A joint German-Italian program, its leaders were Dr. Richard Miethe and Professor Giuseppe Belluzzo, a senior scientist under the Mussolini regime. Their design was again a flying saucer and was very similar to a post-war design created by a British engineer, suggesting some post-war cooperation in the early Cold War period, which we will return to presently. Regarding actual evidence for what I've outlined so far, we have the testimonies of many involved, but of course they could be lying. Design drawings from all 3 projects do exist from World War II, as well as some other documents of the period, including one listing thrust figures and other technical data that had been derived from physical tests. A second photograph of a disc in flight was found with these documents, but may have been planted there with the papers the post-war period to add veracity to the story. At this point, I think it's also worth saying that other countries apart from Germany had also been experimenting with circular aircraft designs in the 1930s and 40s, including the United States, the Vought company producing the V-173 Flying Pancake in 1942 and the XF-5U in 1943. Though the purported German designs seemed to be far in advance of anything the Americans were coming up with. So what became of the actual flying discs the three projects designed and possibly built? According to the testimony of all the engineers involved, the three projects were abandoned the 15th of April 1945 as the Red Army closed in on Prague. The machines were said to have been dragged out of the hangars and burned. All documentation and models were packed up and the technical teams departed post-haste for Germany. Schriever set himself up in post-war Germany as an inventor, supplementing his income by working as a truck driver for the US occupation authorities. On the 4th of August 1948, his workshop at Bremerhaven-Leer was burgled and all flying disc plans and models were stolen. He claims he was approached by agents from a Western intelligence agency wanting information about flying discs, but he refused to help them. Schriever officially died in 1953, though subsequently in the mid-1960s he was reportedly seen by people who had known him, very much alive and well. Epp continued his flying disc design work post-war, claiming to have built an airworthy model in 1946, continuing with flight tests of models throughout the 1950s. He also wrote about Nazi flying discs and was interviewed on several television programs. He claimed that he approached the Americans with his designs after the war but was rebuffed. He married and settled in what became East Germany and tried with the Soviets to interest them in his work, again without success. Returning to West Germany in 1956, he applied to patent his design, but the US authorities apparently delayed granting the patent for 10 years. All of this is very strange, for the US was very interested in nearly everything the Nazis had designed and built in World War II. Operation Paperclip had seen the US round up and remove to America thousands of scientists and engineers in all fields, with military applications including aircraft design and rocketry. The US was interested in flying disc technology because we have undeniable evidence of a secret program the United States Air Force funded in the 1950s and 60s into flying disc technology. More on that in a moment. So if they were not interested in Epp's work and couldn't get Schriever to cooperate, where did they obtain technical data and designs to kickstart their own program? Well, the suggestion is they got this information from the German who ran the third flying disc program, Dr. Richard Miethe. This is a model of the Miethe discus based on the known design. It had an internal rotating jet engine to provide propulsion. Takeoff was down a ramp using a rocket-assisted catapult. The craft had landing gear similar to the Messerschmitt 163 consisting of two retractable skids. Now look at this. This aircraft was codenamed Project Y and was designed and built in 1952 by British aerospace engineer John Frost at Avro Canada's Special Projects Group. This spade-shaped fighter shares some similarities to Miethe's original design. It has been rumoured that Dr. Miethe cooperated with such secret design work in Canada. John Frost's design, which was only ever a wooden mock-up, was called the Flying Manta. Frost was a British aerospace engineer and designer who worked for de Havilland during the war, being involved with creating the de Havilland DH-108 Swallow, a swept-wing tailless fighter from 1946 that held the world speed record. In 1947, Frost moved to Canada, joining Avro, developing the CF-100 jet fighter interceptor, and was involved with the Special Projects Group, a top-secret experimental aircraft unit established in 1952, where he and his team tried to create a vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. Project Y was the first attempt. The post-war input of Miethe into this design and the subsequent Avro car flying disc built by Frost and his team at Avro for the US Air Force has been suggested many times. The VZ-9 Avro car was created in the search for VTOL aircraft that could be used following a nuclear exchange, where most conventional airfields and runways had been destroyed. Codenamed Project Silverbug, Frost and his team designed and built 2 working Avro cars, the first flight being made in November 1959. The design used a single turbo rotor to provide lift and thrust, blowing exhaust out of the rim of the saucer. Though the craft would hover and fly just off the ground, gaining significant altitude was a problem the Avro team apparently couldn't solve, and accordingly in 1961 the US Air Force, who provided the funding, pulled the plug on the project and the Avro car was terminated. Of course, the similarities between the German World War II flying saucer projects and those of Avro Canada and the US military may only be coincidental, but we can deduce certain things from them. Firstly, it appears that if Avro Canada and the US were using German engineers like Miethe to assist with the Project Y and Project Silverbug aircraft, the Germans probably had not been able to make their own flying discs fly before the end of the war shut down their research. The Avro car could barely fly over a decade and a half after the war, and this problem should have been solved if the Germans had been so far along with their own research and development as many authors and witnesses have claimed they were. Secondly, even if the Avro Canada project had received no input from Nazi-era engineers, it faced the same seemingly insurmountable problems of getting a saucer-shaped craft to fly, which seems odd if the Germans had already figured it all out in the 1940s. One would have expected better progress by engineers in the late 1950s and early 1960s with more resources, computer power, and bigger teams of engineers. Thirdly, the Avro car puts paid to any notion that the US had captured Nazi flying saucers around the time of the Roswell incident in 1947 and many other UFO sightings, because again, if they had, why was the Avro car a failure? What people were reporting as UFOs in the 1940s and 50s must indeed have been not of US manufacture.
I am here to discuss the so-called flying saucers. The Air Force interest in this problem has been due to our feeling of an obligation to identify and analyze to the best of our ability anything in the air that may have the possibility of threat or menace to the United States. In pursuit of this obligation, since 1947, we have received and analyzed between 1,000 and 2,000 reports that have come to us from all kinds of sources. Of this great mass of reports, we have been able adequately to explain the great bulk of them, explain them to our own satisfaction. We've been able to explain them as hoaxes, as erroneously identified friendly aircraft, as meteorological or electronic phenomena, or as light aberrations. However, there have been a certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things. It is this group of observations that we now are attempting to resolve. Our basic difficulty in dealing with these is that there is no measurement of them that makes it possible for us to put them in any pattern that would be profitable for a deliberate, custom sort of analysis to take the next step. We have, as of date, come to only one firm conclusion with respect to this remaining percentage, and that is that it does not contain any pattern of purpose or of consistency that we can relate with to any conceivable threat to the United States.
Fourthly, do we believe the US Air Force story that the Avro car was terminated in 1961? The Groom Lake Test Facility in Nevada, known more popularly as Area 51, was operational from 1955 onwards, and subsequent secret aircraft projects, including the U-2, the SR-71 Blackbird, and the F-117 stealth fighter, were all developed there in great secrecy. Did flying disc research really end in 1961? Of course, there is one obvious point that we must consider, that Epp, Schriever, Miethe, and all the other engineers, pilots, etc., who spoke about Nazi flying saucer research were lying. The entire program was a fiction that has been turned into a believable story by authors and documentary filmmakers, and that flying disc research really only got underway in the 1950s in Canada and the United States and disappeared by the early 1960s as engineers couldn't make them work. As the Germans seem to have experimented with every other type of aerial vehicle during World War II, I think it likely that some experimental work was conducted during the war into flying discs, but whether any were ever built or even flew, we cannot know for sure. But I can tell you that Hitler never flew in one to a secret base in Antarctica. Of that you can be sure. Thanks for watching, please subscribe and share, and also visit my audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon, details in the description box below.